So friends, for today's video, I wanted to go through a list of what a lot of people consider to be somewhat staples in the fantasy genre, whether you agree or not with that title being associated with a lot of these. At the end of the day, some of them are extremely popular. When people are looking to get into fantasy, these tend to be the books that first come up. They're on a ton of best of lists, and they often are the ones that people start with, and then they branch out from there, maybe find more of their taste through these. They can better decide for themselves what they like and what they don't like. And why I wanted to make this list is for a couple of reasons. I wanted to, for if you are somebody who's a voracious fantasy reader and you've read through pretty much all of these and you're thinking, I would like some alternatives, or I really liked this one, what are some other things like it? I wanted to be able to provide that for that group over here. And then I also figured for the people that are coming into fantasy and they are seeing all of these big ones, but they're thinking, I actually don't need to feel like I'm a part of the conversation. Are there ones that are lesser known where I'll feel less impacted by outside voices and maybe I can dive into fantasy sort of almost like at my own pace without having the fandoms associated with the stories? Then you have those as well. So regardless of the reason, hopefully there will be something here that you find that you like. Jumping into it, I want to start with Wheel of Time because this is a slightly older fantasy work. It's one that a lot of people grew up reading. It's one that a lot of people find is kind of like the bridge between classic fantasy and more modern fantasy. Plus there's an adaptation, so it's huge at this point. And if you're somebody who really likes the sort of quest feeling that all of a sudden this just regular person is suddenly thrust upon this epic quest, then I would recommend Green Rider. This is one that is still ongoing actually, and it's a long series, but the very first one has such a cozy feel, as it does feel very reminiscent of a lot of older fantasy works. It has a lot of the things about older fantasy works that a lot of us still find ourselves wanting to come back to, and some of the ways in which I think that's represented well is rooted in this sort of quest fantasy where somebody is unexpectedly finding themselves very important. And so you have this main character who in Wheel of Time has realized that there is a threat to everybody they love and they are forced to go on the run. There is this wise mentor figure that guides them, and they are trying to get from basically location A to location B, and there's some rumblings, there's some rumors that this individual might be a chosen one, that sort of thing. But there is a Dark Lord, and that is something you see in a lot of older fantasy, and so it's kind of looking at ultimate evil, ultimate good, but you really dive more than just that surface level description of protagonist, antagonist, and you really examine all the levels in between. And this is where I think you're going to find a good parallel with Green Rider. In this first book, our main character is somebody, she is on her way to go from this school that she was attending to go see her father. And on the way there, there is a person who seems to be a messenger who basically dies in our character's arms, begging her to please deliver this message. It is important for the whole realm. And she figures, well, I guess I'll do that for him. It seems important, and he's dead, basically. So I feel like I owe it to him. And she takes this upon herself, and then all of a sudden is finding a lot of enemies are after her, and she doesn't really know what's going on. She does not have a wise mentor to guide her, but she is a really admirable main character. You get to know her, not through her journey, but some of the side characters, and she's somebody who sticks up for people. If there is somebody who is typically weaker, you could say, than her, then she does everything in her power to protect them, to stand up for them. And she's just in general a really rootable protagonist. I really liked her. And I liked that journey feeling. Both Wheel of Time and this one have that journey feeling as you progress. And for me, I actually find I preferred Green Rider over Wheel of Time. Wheel of Time, I gave a few books and I was like, I don't know if this is for me, but Green Rider, I'm like, I can't wait to read more. So if you are somebody who's tried Wheel of Time but didn't quite work, but you still want something with that quest fantasy feel, then this one will likely fit the bill, I think, pretty well. And if you do like Wheel of Time, then maybe give this one a go. Next up, we have some Joe Abercrombie. I'm going in a pretty different direction. I actually thought it'd be kind of fun to mention Joe Abercrombie after Wheel of Time, because Wheel of Time is known for being almost like quintessential good versus evil, big epic quest fantasy, whereas Abercrombie is known for dissecting that archetype, you could say, and really examining what would be a real raw look at that. And I think that's why a lot of people really like Abercrombie's works. They do feel meandering. They do feel like there's no plot. They don't feel like there's a set antagonist. And it's kind of cool to see somebody who's clearly a fan of the genre criticizing it while still paying respects to it. So if you've not checked out Abercrombie and that sounds appealing to you, then that's going to give you an idea of his works. I wanted to compare his work to Andrzej Sapkowski, but I actually feel like the Witcher series is also considered a staple at this point, so we're going to save Witcher for later and talk about it in its own right. But with Abercrombie, I wanted to highlight a couple of lesser-known stories, and one would be Engines of Empire, and the other would be Justice of Kings. Justice of Kings, I think, is more like First Law than Engines of Empire. I'll get to Engines of Empire in a second and just focus on Justice of Kings. I think the writing is more like Abercrombie if Abercrombie was a little more serious more often, because he often interjects humor into his very gritty, very real, very dark world. And he's kind of known for having a very bleak outlook in his books and for it to feel like, oh, okay, so nothing matters because people in power always stay in power and nobody really makes a difference. And I do feel like that sense of helplessness to the whims of those in power is present in Justice of Kings as well. But I would say that the story feels a little bit heavier, but when the funny moments do happen, they're hilarious. I laughed out loud multiple times reading specifically the sequel, Tyranny of Faith, because there's just some very dark humor that I quite enjoyed. But it's really examining people who are in positions of power. They're not necessarily the absolute highest up, but the morality that they have to compromise when they are given so much power and have to wield that power, and they don't always get to wield it in what they feel is what they have determined to be the best way to go about it, but rather what somebody else is telling them would be the best. Sometimes it's another person, sometimes it's the law, sometimes it's what society is expecting of them and the pressures that that puts on a person, but also looking at, is it ever okay for one person to hold that much power? So I think there's a lot of really great philosophical musings that are present in both Abercrombie's works and in Justice of Kings, plus they're both very, very gritty. Then with Engines of Empire, I'm more so comparing this to Abercrombie's second series in his First Law world, which would be the Age of Madness series, as I find it's the setting that makes these somewhat similar to each other. Both have this sort of turn-of-the-century feel. Both of them have characters that are profiting off of the hard labor and conquering of other groups of people, the mistreatment of other groups of people, undervaluing the working class. You see that in both series. Engines of Empire has a little bit more magic to it. There is some magic in Abercrombie's First Law world, but it's pretty low magic, and it doesn't play as big of a role in the story. With Engines of Empire, you do see magic kind of butting heads with, well, I should say magic and religion butting heads with technological advancements, and I think that that was a really interesting thing to dissect. The way in which it's dissected, I think, is similar to how I would expect Abercrombie to dissect something like that. Also, in general, I just think both Engines of Empire and Justice of Kings are pretty underhyped, and I think a lot of people would really, really enjoy both of them. Now moving on to Robin Hobb. I'm just gonna go ahead and say Realm of the Elderlings, but honestly, there's a lot of differences from one of her series to the next in Realm of Elderlings. Ship of Magic, for example, is very, very different than Assassin's Apprentice, so it's hard to narrow down exactly, and I actually decided I'm going to do a whole video dedicated to, if you like Robin Hobb, check out these other books or maybe these other authors. So there's going to be more than just the one that I mentioned today. So be on the lookout for that if you are a Robin Hobb fan. But the one that I'm going to mention today is Age of Assassins. And the reason I decided to focus and zero in on this one is because if you are looking to start Robin Hobb, or if you've at least begun your Realm of the Elderlings journey, you've likely started with the Farseer trilogy. And I do find that Fitz and his story and how he fits into what is going on with other powerful individuals, it's similar in a lot of ways to what the character in Age of Assassins is experiencing. And if you're somebody who really enjoys watching, this is going to sound morbid, but a character that has very little agency over their own life and they're very much stuck, and it's people in power that really dictate their life pretty much in its entirety, and the toll that can take on a person, the depression that can weigh on them. If you're somebody who enjoys, is probably not the right word, but if you're somebody who finds yourself gripped by those kinds of books. I'm not judging, by the way. I was just trying to figure out a way to word that. But anyway, both of these books have that present within them. I think that Fitz is a character who, throughout the Farseer trilogy, is someone who definitely goes through a lot emotionally. And it's not that the character in Age of Assassins does not. It's just that I think how that is traversed is a little bit different. And I'm bringing this up because Fitz is very much a love or hate character. I find it's very rare for people to say, like, I thought he was all right, you know. Either people are like, oh, Fitz, I love him so much. Or they're like, yeah, Fitz is annoying. So I don't think the character in Age of Assassins is quite as polarizing, is my point. I do think that you get more of a mentor-mentee relationship in Age of Assassins than you do in the Farseer trilogy. There's some people that play a role in Fitz's life, but I think there is a more direct mentor-mentee relationship in Age of Assassins, which for me definitely brought it up. I love that particular trope in fantasy. It's one of my favorites, actually. And I had a while back done a whole video dedicated to some of my favorite tropes, specifically with mentor-mentee as the focus. And it was inspired by the relationship between the characters in this book because it was one of my favorites. Moving on now, I mentioned Witcher a little bit ago, so we'll go ahead and talk about Witcher now. So if you like Witcher, same goes for when I talked about Abercrombie. You could just check out both of them. But there are two different stories that are quite different from one another, but they have certain aspects to them that I think can tie back to how Andrzej Sapkowski writes and or his stories and characters, and that would be the book Godkiller and the book The Grace of Kings. So Grace of Kings might seem a little bit out there as a recommendation, as it doesn't seem like if you've read both of them that they would have that much in common, but we come to books with different expectations and different things we pull from them and really enjoy. And one of the things that I think Witcher is known for is having a very, very gritty, realistic, historical world that also has magic within it. So it almost feels like you're reading about history, but then there's lots of magic too. In the Witcher series, I definitely think that the magic feels a little bit closer. You have actual characters that you're following that are able to wield magics. For example, the character of Yennefer is a powerful sorceress, and there's a whole lodge of sorceresses that a lot of people associate with Witcher, and Ciri's known for being a magical figure. So with the Dandelion Dynasty, it's a little bit different, but it still has something I think a lot of people are going to really enjoy, and that's quite cool, which is that it has an extremely historical setting, but it has this feeling of what if gods were definitely real and playing a role in humans' lives and they were manipulating things to work in their favor? What would that look like? So you follow people, and then you're looking at the conversations between very, very, very powerful beings, and then you're seeing these conversations trickle down into the humans and how it messes everything up, or how it elevates them for a while, but then because a lot of time passes, oh look, it messes everything up again. And one of the things that Witcher, this is a hit or miss for a lot of people, is that you will randomly abandon your characters to look at other people that tend to be nobles, kings and queens, and their conversations with one another, and you're like, why am I looking at this? But then you're seeing how that conversation suddenly has a drastic impact on the main characters, and a very similar thing can be said of Grace of Kings. The other reason I wanted to highlight these two with each other is because both of them, I think, are great at that short story feel. Sapkowski literally starts the Witcher series with a collection of short stories. He has 2 collections of short stories. And then with Grace of Kings, you find that even though they're not short stories, there will be times where you're introduced to a character, you get to know them in a very brief amount of time, and then it's kind of like their arc is over. Okay, now we'll see what affected the main characters based off of this. And it feels like there's a lot of short stories woven into the main narrative, and that's another reason why I think if you like one of these authors, you might like the other. As for Godkiller, broken record, I say all the time that if you like the Geralt and Ciri relationship in the Witcher series and you wish that was a bigger focus, check out Godkiller. There's not much else I need to say. That's not true. I'm going to add some more. So Geralt is kind of shunned in society for being a Witcher. The character in Godkiller is a Godkiller. The gods are somewhat like the monsters in the Witcher series. They definitely play a role and in how they affect society and how they manipulate people, trick people, have horrible effects on people's lives, and still society finds a way to hate the people that take care of these beings. So in that sense, our main character in Godkiller has a similar life experience to Geralt. The last one I'm going to recommend for today is one that it doesn't get talked about as much these days, but I find a lot of fantasy readers read this when they were younger. And then on top of that, I find that a lot of people, when they're looking at lists of fantasy to check out, this one often shows up, even though I don't feel like all that many of us are talking about it these days. And that would be Garth Nix's The Old Kingdom, I believe is what the series is called, but it starts with Sabriel. I've read this twice. I want to reread it again. I want to reread the whole series. I don't remember it that well, but one of the things that this series is known for is having necromancers in it, or magic that has to do with death. And interestingly, even though I feel like that's a pretty common character type or profession, magic user, you could say, there's not that many fantasy stories that utilize death magic, but there's a couple that come to mind. And the other ones that I talked about, there are definitely more parallels than just the magic system. So I do want to kind of throw this out to all of you. For those of you that have read the Old Kingdom series and you're big fans of it, what would be your recommendations? Feel free, of course, to leave your recommendations for the other ones that I mentioned as well. But the ones that I'm going to highlight today, the writing is not necessarily similar, but if you're looking for something that has the death magic, these next two books are going to scratch that itch, and that would be Gideon the Ninth and Bonesmith. I actually think Gideon the Ninth and Bonesmith are more like each other than they are like the Old Kingdom, but I still wanted to highlight that Gideon the Ninth has done very well for itself. So it's possible you've actually heard of Gideon the Ninth before you've heard about the Old Kingdom. But regardless, both of these use death magic in a way that's quite unique. So Sabriel, our main character, she uses bells, and there's almost like different levels of the afterlife that she can start to get to, almost like this area that exists in between, and the further in she goes, there's differences from one level to the next, one tier to the next, you could say. And in Bonesmith, there's something similar with the kinds of beings that our character is able to fight, and the magic she's able to use, those sorts of things. So that tier level system is common in both of these. Then with Gideon the Ninth, the writing is so different. I would say Bonesmith and Gideon the Ninth have kind of a fun feel to them, whereas I got a more serious tone from Sabriel. But in Gideon the Ninth, basically imagine a fantastic writing. I was about to say writing system. That's not a thing. Magic systems are a thing. Think about fantastic writing mixed with really, really stupid humor, and very intentionally stupid. Like, it's supposed to be a hilarious juxtaposition between the two, and that's Gideon the Ninth. I've also said to some of my friends that Gideon the Ninth is like, what if Trevor Belmont from Castlevania was a book? And that would be Gideon the Ninth. So if that sounds appealing to you, hey, there's another Castlevania is kind of a thing a lot of people check out, so maybe try Gideon the Ninth. But regardless, Gideon herself in the book Gideon the Ninth, she herself is not a necromancer, but she protects a necromancer. There's a ton of banter between these two. She's not always sure what the heck is going on, but the necromancer powers seem very interesting, and so you're kind of getting glimpses of it through Gideon's perspective as a guard to a necromancer. And it seems like there's houses, of course, because the ninth in the Gideon the Ninth title is associated with the different houses. So there's 9 houses, and they are trying to basically compete with one another to gain knowledge, to almost ascend to godhood in a sense, to gain immortality. So it's a really cool premise, and the magic with bones and death and those sorts of things is utilized in a way that I think is quite interesting. And with Bonesmith, it's a lot of world building tied to the magic, and there's not just bone magic. There's a lot of other death magic and goldsmiths and things like that in the story, and there's different houses in that as well, which I think just creates for interesting scheming within the story. This one, like I said, I just really want to emphasize the least like each other of all of the ones I've talked about. I think there's some pretty solid, if you like this, there's a really good chance you might like this, or you might like this better. This one, it's more of just that magic system, but still, if you have death magic recommendations, feel free to leave those, or if you find something there's the tone that's a little bit more in alignment, feel free to recommend them as well. I do have a lot of other staples, you could say, in fantasy with some lesser known works to compare them to. So if you'd like to see a part 2, let me know. I would be very happy to do that. But thanks so much for watching. If you are interested in any of these, I'll have them in the description bar down below. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later.